Bonsoir, mon nom est Anne Chapas et je suis la co-directrice générale par intérim du Musée des Beaux-Arts. Nous attendons notre nouveau directeur général prochainement et donc j'ai été nommée. J'ai le grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir pour la Nuit des Idées, une soirée toute spéciale. Cette Nuit des Idées est un événement important et global qui rassemble dans le monde entier des gens de divers parcours, diverses professions, diverses spécialités qui se réunissent pour réfléchir à des idées, à des préoccupations de notre société. Ce soir, cet événement a lieu dans plus de 80 pays. 200 événements sont organisés sur 5 continents. Together with the French Embassy in Ottawa, we at the National Gallery are very proud to be among those participating in such a meaningful event. Et j'aimerais remercier l'ambassade de France à Ottawa, l'instigatrice de cette initiative et notre partenaire dans l'organisation de cette soirée. Nous sommes ravis de compter parmi nous ce soir son Excellence Madame Karine Rispal, ambassadrice de France au Canada. Bienvenue, chère Karine. I would like to acknowledge the support of our two other partners, Carleton University and ArcticNet, who have been key contributors to tonight's impressive panel of speakers. Je salue nos 4 panélistes présents ce soir qui ont fait le déplacement. Marie Bello, juste là, Louis Fortier, Célina Jeffrey et Alice Sharp. Veuillez noter que cette rencontre se déroule principalement en français et l'interprétation simultanée est disponible pour ceux et celles qui le souhaitent. Les appareils se trouvent juste à l'arrière, au-dessus de la colonnade. Lors de la table ronde, je vous encourage à poser vos questions soit en français, soit en anglais, dans la langue officielle de votre choix. I would also like to mention that 7 Tapas Bar is open and will be serving food for purchase here in the Great Hall until 8:30 and drinks until 9. Tapas Bar is right over there. Thank you to the French Embassy for the wonderful refreshments. That's very generous. Madame l'ambassadrice, je vous invite à prendre la parole pour nous ce soir et après nous passerons au déroulement du programme. Merci.
Bonsoir, merci Anne pour ces mots d'introduction. Merci surtout au Musée des Beaux-Arts pour nous avoir accueillis, pour nous accueillir ce soir et pour organiser cet événement avec l'ambassade. You might know, or perhaps you don't know, the Night of the Ideas was launched in 2016 in Paris, and since then it has become a huge success, and every year in the world we have this Night of Ideas. So this year we will have more than 200 events in more than 80 countries. And in Canada itself we will have La Nuit des Idées in 7 different places. The aim for this Night of Ideas is really to open a space for debating, sharing ideas, opinions, culture, perceptions, and it will bring together experts, artists, writers, philosophers, scientists, well, all different kinds of people and citizens. Débattre est important, particulièrement dans les pays où la liberté d'expression est un enjeu. En France et en Canada, ce n'est pas un enjeu, mais débattre, ça reste extrêmement important. Et peut-être qu'on passe d'ailleurs trop de temps sur nos téléphones et qu'on ne débat pas assez, donc je suis contente de pouvoir ce soir débattre avec vous et avec surtout nos panélistes. The theme of La Nuit des Idées this year is Facing Our Time, face au présent. And honestly, I didn't choose the theme myself, but I couldn't think of a more relevant theme for this year. Because when you think about it, we face so many challenges, migration, globalization, education, climate change. Il était donc naturel et évident pour nous de s'associer au musée des Beaux-Arts pour avoir cette nuit des idées, surtout qu'il y a cette magnifique exposition Anthropocène, ce travail collectif de Edward Burtonsky, Jennifer Bechwal et Nicolas Depensier. I don't know if you've seen the exhibition, but it explores the impact of human activities. And I should say that it's at the same time magnificent and scary. The conversation tonight will reflect upon c'est très dur à dire, problèmes d'environnement et les problèmes d'éthique. Il y a des panélistes prestigieux. Merci à tous et à toutes. On a un panel très féminin, je m'en réjouis, ce soir, d'être là. Et une petite mention spéciale pour Marie Baléo, qui a fait le voyage depuis la France. Je vous souhaite une très bonne soirée.
Merci Karine. Avant de commencer, je crois qu'il est important de rappeler que nous sommes sur le territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine. Art offers meaningful experiences that create consciousness and empowers each one of us. This is particularly true of the remarkable Anthropocene exhibition. And for those who have not yet had the chance to see it, it's open tonight until 8:30 and it's right straight ahead down the hallway. It's really a remarkable exhibition that will go on tour in Europe and in the rest of the world. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to see it here in Ottawa. I would like to introduce now Andrea Cunard, Associate Curator of our Photographs collection here at the gallery, who curated this wonderful exhibition. Andrea's work focuses on the cultural uses of photography and its capacity to challenge, to reconfigure the norms of the public and private, subjectivity, memory, and knowledge. Her impressive professional background includes teaching photo history, Canadian art, and cultural theory at Carleton and Queen's Universities, and lecturing on photography throughout Canada. Je cède donc la parole à Andrea pour qu'elle vous présente nos panélistes et je me réjouis de débattre avec vous. Merci. Thank you.
Merci Anne. Bonsoir mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue à la Nuit des idées. Pour moi, cette nuit est très importante parce qu'elle offre l'occasion de réfléchir à l'idée de l'Anthropocène. Et je comprends le sujet comme un processus. I'd like to think of the Anthropocene not as any one thing in particular, but as a placeholder around and through which thoughts, experiences, ideas, and feelings can be expressed, shared, discussed, and listened to. In particular, I'm interested in how the Anthropocene reveals the permanent impermanence of boundaries, which creates many anxieties, but also opportunities. I think of the mass movement of peoples across borders, or their incapacity to do so. How the melting permafrost shifts the grounds and infrastructures of the North. What are we walking on now? The collapse of coastlines through rising sea levels. What is exactly happening at the edges now? But perhaps more importantly, I see the Anthropocene as an opportunity to discuss how to open up the boundaries that define dichotomies such as human, technology, subject-object, animal-human, presence-absence, art-science, and nature-culture to a process of questioning, discovery, and curiosity. And to that end, let me introduce our guests. Marie Bellio is a writer, poet, and editor. She's head of publications at La Fabrique de la Cité, the Paris-based think tank on urban transitions and innovations. In 2017, she conducted a research project and drafted a report on temporary housing for asylum seekers in German and Swedish cities. In 2018, she wrote a study on the affordable housing challenge in growing European metropolises. Marie also serves as editor for American literary journal Panorama, the Journal of Intelligent Travel. Her fiction, nonfiction, and poetry have been published in several literary magazines in the United States. Our next guest, Louis Fortier, est professeur-chercheur en océanographie au département de biologie de l'Université Laval. Au cours des dernières années, il s'est beaucoup investi ici et à l'étranger dans la sensibilisation du grand public et des politiques à l'impact des changements climatiques dans l'hémisphère nord. Louis is a tireless promoter of a multidisciplinary and cross-sectorial approach to the ecosystem-level concerns raised by the warming of the Arctic. He has led the Canadian participation to several international programs, including highly successful research expeditions on the response of the Arctic Ocean to global climate change. He holds the Canada Research Chair on the response of Arctic marine ecosystems and to climate warming, and has sat from 2005 to 2008 on the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. He was instrumental in founding ArcticNet, along with Canada's foremost Arctic specialists in the natural, social, and health sciences, which aims to anticipate the impacts of climate warming and modernization in the Arctic. Selena Jeffrey, Associate Professor, Ottawa University, and Curator of Ephemeral Coast. As a Professor of Art History and Theory, curator, writer, and editor, Selena Jeffrey seeks to create new avenues of creative research and scholarship. She uses curatorial strategies for interdisciplinary collaborations that focus on environmental degradation. In 2004, Selena co-founded and is currently the editor of Drain magazine, a journal of contemporary art and culture. She has also curated over 15 exhibitions internationally and is presently undertaking a major research project, Ephemeral Coast, which examines through curatorial projects the radical shifts in geography literally taking place now as a result of environmental degradation. Alice Sharp, Director Curator of UK-based art and science environmental organization Invisible Dust. In 2009, Alice Sharp established Invisible Dust, an award-winning charity and art and environmental organization that has raised over £1 million to commission art projects relating to the environment. In 2015, she won the Guardian PEA People, Environment and Achievement Award, UK Arts, Fashion, and Music and Film Award, recognizing inspirational people who are making a difference to the green agenda. In 2015, Alice co-curated Offshore, Artists Explore the Sea, working with scientific advisors to examine the many contrasting ways that the sea has shaped our culture, our imaginations, and our physical existence. That is our guests for tonight. Let's give them a warm welcome. Some have traveled a long way. And we will hear now from Marie, who will give us a little summary of her background.
Thank you, Andrea. I want to start by thanking the French Embassy and the National Gallery of Canada for this opportunity to discuss such a fascinating topic and in such great company. I'm very pleased to be here in Ottawa today, though it took me a long time to get here. And to have had the chance to discover the amazing exhibition that you have on display here. So I'm not going to introduce myself obviously again, but as Andrea mentioned, I conducted a research project in 2017 about the resilience of cities to demographic shocks, and specifically to the strategies deployed by German and Swedish cities to welcome and house newcomers starting in 2015 from a great number of countries, but mostly from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Eritrea. And the questions that I looked into were, how did those cities, which were for the most part wholly unprepared to respond to this challenge, how did they manage to house these people when sometimes on some days several hundred people were coming in at the same time? And also in the longer term, what kind of shelter and accommodation were they able to provide while asylum seekers were waiting to hear back about their asylum request? The topic was really fascinating, and the conversations that sprung up all around Europe were both very fruitful and much needed. And the project really allowed us at La Fabrique de la Cité to delve deeper into the notion of urban resilience, which is the capacity of a city to resist and adapt either to chronic stress or, in this case, to an acute shock. And one of the main findings of our work was, and this really surprised us, that many of those European cities seem to regard the 2015 episode as an isolated incident, while we, on the other hand, believe that it was evidence of a broader shift in paradigm whereby large-scale migrations are going to increase both in frequency and in volume, whether they be due to economic hardship, to war, or to climate change. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and this we didn't touch on during the project because, again, it was related to this very specific period and those German and Swedish cities, but what I find really striking is that there is virtually no public debate yet about climate-induced migration. Yet in a world where average temperatures are set to rise by 4 degrees Celsius before the end of the century, or even before 2060, according to some experts, it seems almost reckless not to start thinking now about ways that cities, communities, states can accommodate these increased migrations. The real question coming for us at La Fabrique de la Cité is how cities will respond to these migrations, to these flows, how they will adapt, and how urban stakeholders, whether they be local authorities or the civil society or private actors, learn how to take in hundreds, thousands of newcomers as seamlessly and as efficiently as possible. And this, of course, raises countless questions, whether it be about the availability of affordable housing, the state and capacity of infrastructure, and it's, as if infrastructure will have to absorb this demographic growth, but also more broadly and more simply about social resilience. And these are all questions that require thinking now about the kind of future we envision and want for ourselves. And I think this question of the kind of future we envision is really interesting. I was recently told by a reader of mine who happens to be my best friend, she's one of my 3 readers with my mother and my grandmother, that much of my work is very pessimistic. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm the perkiest person there ever was, but then I went back and reread the stuff I wrote and found that indeed much of what I write about is what happens after a disaster and what the world and the personal or individual life might resemble once they've both been upended. And in this sense, I think I'm representative of a new trend. I think many of us are slowly adopting the premise that the generations that are currently alive are witnessing, obviously not the end of the world, but at least the beginning of the end of us, of human species or civilization. And this sense of impending doom, in a sense, is only compounded by the ongoing, I would say, failure or breakdown of liberal democracy in many countries around the world, and the hopelessness that this change is inducing in many of us. And think only of the incredible success of dystopian literature in the past few years. And dystopian literature, I think, is particularly striking, again, going back to this topic of resilience, because it really questions what human resilience will look like after. So after, the epidemic that wipes out half of mankind, or after, climate-induced disaster, or, just after a war. And I recently read a novel, which I think probably some of you will be familiar with, that is called Exit West by the novelist Mohsin Hamid, which was published in 2017. And the novel is about 2 people, Nadia and Saeed, who live in a unnamed but probably Middle Eastern city in the early stages of a war. And the story revolves, I hate to spoil it, but I'm going to do it anyway, around mysterious doorways that appear everywhere around the city and that allow the poorer inhabitants to leave and emerge in a completely different place in the world. And what's really interesting is that the villains in this story are always the people who are trying to limit the mobility of Nadia and Said, whether it be sort of the religious fanatics that are trying to keep them from leaving in the first place, or the host state that takes up arms and tries to chase them out of the building they're occupying later on once they get to leave. The Canadian journalist Cory Doctorow read the novel and wrote a fascinating review, and he writes at one point that the relentless drive to change and move is pitted against the mulish insistence on things staying the same. And while the status quo has historically enjoyed the home team advantage over the forces of change and migration, the doors tip the balance, making a mockery of borders. And when I read this, I thought, the decision by some to call the current epoch that we're in by the name Anthropocene is just an invitation to do just that, make a mockery of borders, whether they be traditional dichotomies or even the very artificial border that we cannot let go of between nature and culture. And as such, I think this current period that we're in is an opportunity to reconsider existing frameworks and mindsets, especially, again, as they relate to migration, because the sedentary individual of today might very well be a migrant tomorrow. And who is to say what our concept of home will become? For now, it's a very static place to which much is affixed emotionally and financially, but in a context of climate change and increasing migrations, this may not always remain the same. What I guess I want to get at is beyond the hopelessness of my writing, apparently. I think the Anthropocene is not just cause for concern, fear, or anxiety. It is not an excuse for paralysis or passive hopelessness, but it is, like all times of complete transformation, an opportunity to reform, to reflect, and to recalibrate. And we have to think differently about the problems of our era and to find new and collaborative ways to, tackle the challenges that are already there. And this moment, I think, in the end, is just a test of our ability to reconsider the ways that we have of inhabiting cities, of working, of moving around cities, and realizing that these are only some of many possible options. And in short, I think this period is a test of our ability and our willingness to embrace change. Thank you.
Okay. Monsieur Fautier.
Merci Andrea. Madame l'ambassadrice, chers amis, bonsoir, bienvenue à cette Nuit des Idées. So I'm the scientist on duty tonight, and this is all about the Anthropocene. So I guess you have guessed already that I'm not going to talk about good news. Pessimistic, you were saying, Maria? Hold on to your chair. Yeah. So, the Anthropocene, for me, it's this footprint that we're living, that we're putting on the planet as one single species. It's the first time, in fact, the second time in geological history that the species has so much impact on the, as far as we know, on the planet. The first time was 2.2 billion years ago, when cyanobacteria started to transform the methane and CO2 atmosphere into an oxygen atmosphere. Oxygen, of course, is a highly toxic component, and it killed most of the life that existed on the planet at that time. But it also gave the opportunity to raise a new sort of life, of which we are part. So the Anthropocene at this time, the specialists are they reckon that we are, the footprint that we're leaving on the planet is 1.75 times the footprint that the planet can endure, can survive to. So each year we use about 1.75 times what the planet can give us. So we're eating on the capital at this time. We're in financial terms. And so for scientists, it's not a very interesting mandate to explain that to the general public and to the decision makers, because we're talking about, bad news and Myself, I was raised in the Catholic faith, you know, and every day of my youth, some priest would come over and threaten me with the fire of hell if I wouldn't repent, you know. I had to repent, and I hated it. It really spoiled my youth and everything. And now sometimes I feel that I'm doing the same thing. You know, I'm the doomsayer, telling people repent, otherwise you're gonna all boil on the planet. So it's not easy for scientists. You have to understand that to explain all the bad news. The worst, what you hear the most about is climate change, and this is my field of expertise to some extent as a specialist of the Arctic. And you hear a lot about climate change, but actually the footprint that our species is leaving on the planet is made up of many other things than climate change. There are about 9 to 10 major issues, problems that we are causing on the planet at this time. And just to make sure that you cannot go easily to sleep tonight, I'll review those 9 or 10 issues with you. What the scientists did with all the experts and everything, for one issue, we determined a boundary beyond which we shouldn't go. Beyond that boundary, we went too far as a species. We caused too much trouble. For example, for climate change, we're not at the boundary yet. We divide the moment between before us and the boundary, we divide it into 5 steps. And for climate change, for example, we're at step number 2. If we go to step number 5, we're going to go beyond whatever can be recovered, whatever the planet can bounce back from. So quickly, number 1, where we really exceeded the boundary, we're way beyond the boundary, it's biodiversity losses. What we're causing to other species. It's a big theme of the Anthropocene presentation with Sudan, the rhinoceros that goes extinct and everything. But at this time, it's the percentages of reptiles, of birds, of mammals that we have extinguished, if you want, is really scary. It's 20%, 30% of known species that have disappeared. And for the smaller organisms, we have no clue what we have done so far. So biodiversity losses, that's probably the worst. Then it's the nitrogen cycle. This is more complicated, but it's the way we use nitrogen, you know, to grow things and everything. We're creating a disequilibrium on the planet, and we're at about 5 steps. That is, we're just at the boundary of exceeding what the planet can come back from. Climate change, as I said, 3 steps. The other one is ocean acidification. This is something that is really concerning at this time. But we're only 2 steps into having those 3 steps impacts that we will go beyond. We're going to go to a tilting point, equilibrium. The other one is the phosphate cycle. It's like the nitrate cycle. It's one of the most boring issues, if you want. But we're only 2 steps down the way to catastrophe. Then change in land use, 1 step. So it's not that bad. See, we're not helping ourselves, but global freshwater use, which you certainly heard about it, 1 step on the 5-step ladder. Stratospheric ozone depletion, that's one of the most interesting ones. We're only 1 step into trouble, and actually we're coming back from that situation. It's the one example where civilization has taken the means after the Montreal Protocol to reduce the use of the gases that were depleting the ozone layer. So, but in this case, it was really easy because it's the freon that we put in the fridge and everything. So the technicians and everything, they found a replacement that was actually less costly than the freon. So from an economic point of view, it was really easy to solve. So nothing to call your mom about. I mean, we're making progress on that one, but there's nothing really difficult there. The other one is chemical pollution, and in this case, we don't know where we are. But we are certainly very far up the ladder to catastrophe with this one. And the other one is the loading of the atmosphere with aerosols. We don't know where we are. We know that it's a big issue, but we don't know exactly where we are. We cannot say where we are. So that's 10 things that will prevent you from sleeping tonight. And but you see that some of them are not too bad. And we're talking about the Anthropocene, which is the era, the geological era that our species, Homo sapiens, will leave it such a mark that in 100,000 years from now, the geologists and the archaeologists will see a layer of plastic and everything in the sediments. And so the common denominator to all those issues is the same. The root cause, it's all the same. There are too many of us. The population, and you're not supposed to talk about that. It's taboo, but I like to talk about it anyway. But it's an issue of human demography, and not only human demography, but also the demography of all the animals that we grow. You know, the cattle, the chickens, and everything. We don't leave enough room for the other species at this time. And there is one good news that might maybe comfort you. According to the United Nations, our species will grow to 11 billion people by 2100, and that would be catastrophic. But according to other specialists, some of them are saying now that we might reach a peak of about 8.5, 9 billion people by 2050, and then it's going to go down, and all those 10 plagues will also ease up, and we might go through over that wave of that human tide, if you want, and prevent the planet will go on. It's just that our civilization and our species might not go on, as Maria said. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you. Okay, Celine, please.
Many thanks for the invitation this evening, and thank you all for coming out. I'm also here to talk about the Anthropocene, but I'd like to address a couple of issues about how we tell the story of the Anthropocene, why I think artists play a very significant role in this, and how we might be able to kind of politicize action. The writer Rebecca Solnit, when talking about climate change, argues that it also means addressing the problems with the way we produce stories. The Anthropocene exhibition includes one such story: the global dependence on fossil fuels and extraction economies, which has resulted in the most significant problem that humankind has ever faced. We have fundamentally damaged the life support of the system of the planet. And at this critical juncture, human agency is dominating environmental life and extinguishing ecosystems at a devastating rate. Bedinsky, Beischval, de Pensier's Anthropocene project is also helpful in reminding us that human social life is deeply entangled with the loss of other species. Here, there is no longer room for the contemplation of nature at a safe distance. Instead, we are confronted with and haunted by our desire for cheap and expendable nature. In 2000, when Paul Crutzen first asserted that humankind has, quote, become a global geological force in its own right, and announced the Anthropocene epoch, I'm actually unsure that even he could imagine how fast and how devastating the impacts have been felt thus far. According to a recent report in The Guardian, 2018's unrelenting series of storms, droughts, and floods saw over 28 million people in need of humanitarian or emergency aid in result. That's a really staggering number, isn't it? The necessity to draw connections between environmental degradation and environmental justice has been noted by scholars like Rob Dixon, who uses the term slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor to highlight the increasingly violent consequences of environmental injustice. In this regard, the Anthropocene may be considered, as Donna Haraway does, as more of a boundary event than an epoch, literally taking away the boundary beneath our feet. Over the past 4 years or so, my own research project, Ephemeral Coast, has involved working with an array of artists, climate change scientists, and thinkers from the humanities. We all know that the ocean presents the most significant environmental challenge of our time, with the widespread effects of acidification, coral bleaching, and the escalating presence of oceanic plastic among the myriad of problems presenting themselves. Ephemeral Coast has worked internationally in Wales, UK, Mauritius, and Baja California Sur on 9 exhibitions and on the making of a film which is still in process. In one instance, Mauritian artists, for example, spoke of their own colonial heritage from East Africa and southern India as a way to address the ocean as a resource. I developed Ephemeral Coast to consider coastal regions as spaces of unprecedented risk, uncertainty, and contamination, whilst also seeking to reimagine opportunities for belonging, solidarity, and connection. And my main question, which is sort of a question that I think is at large in Anthropocene and perhaps something for us to consider as a group, is what do artists bring to stories about the collapse of the ocean? And how do artists enable us to develop new models of understanding and counteraction? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, Alice.
Got the little sign here, it says, do not touch the podium microphones. So I won't. I wondered one criteria for how they selected all of us to do it tonight, and I decided it was because we all wear glasses. What do you think? I'm Alice Sharp. I'm the curator and director of Invisible Dust. Bonjour, hello. Thank you so much for the National Gallery for inviting me this evening. I've come from London to speak here and also at the Canada Council tomorrow, and it's wonderful to be here looking at this amazing exhibition and talking with this distinguished panel. I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first thing I think is very important is to look at how visibility is important in terms of climate change. What's visible, what's invisible. Secondly, you're going to guess it, what does Invisible Dust do? What do we work on? In particular, a project we've worked on human sensor on air pollution. And thirdly, how do we make women visible for climate change? How can we get women's voices heard? So as you've heard, we're all exploring the Anthropocene. I want to talk about the peculiar nature of the threats that we face in the Anthropocene. What do I mean by this? Well, look at the epoch of the dinosaurs. Ended with a meteorite, came right out the sky, very visible, bang. That was the end of the dinosaurs. It was a direct threat, it was visible. If we had that nature for the Anthropocene, something very visible, something we all understand, then it would be very much easier to do something about it. As humans, we react to big things that move quickly. We understand as humans if a car comes along, we've got to get out of the way. If a lion comes out of a bush, we jump. We're actually not very good with slow. And the problem with the Anthropocene is that many of its effects are invisible to us, and invisible in very many different ways. Let's look at the exhibition. We've got coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is under the sea, so that's first, it's invisible to us in that sense. It's also often quite far away. It's not where we live. The coral bleaching is going on. Something that is close to home is air pollution. All our major cities have problems with air pollution, but it's invisible. In London, we found that the children's playgrounds are more polluted than the surrounding streets. The parents come along, they sit there in their cars, the pollution goes into their children's playground, and they go away again. Now, if we've got that sort of lives that we're living, we're not very good at understanding climate change because it is invisible. Even sea level rise that's been mentioned just recently takes years and years to show its effects in many communities. So it's this invisibility that makes the Anthropocene so dangerous. I work with climate scientists, environmental scientists, but actually people like Louis find it quite difficult to reach the public. It's quite difficult as a scientist to be able to translate those complex ideas into a public audience. So this is what we tackle at Invisible Dust. We take the problems of the Anthropocene and we make them visible. So at Invisible Dust, what I do is I take two groups of people together, artists and scientists. Most people think very different, you know. Quite young in life you have to say, I'm an art person, I'm a science person. Actually, we put them together. We think it's a fantastic combination. And the artists enable things like humour to come out of science, the imagination to come out of science. Actually, a personal connection, something that hits you in the heart, which is what this issue is all about. We've looked at oceans, as was said before. We've looked at biodiversity, climate change, and also air pollution. So we did this amazing project. We had a project which I'm just going to mention called Human Sensor. And in Human Sensor, an artist called Kasia Mulga worked with a scientist, Frank Kelly, and she invented this most beautiful, I urge you to look it up on the internet, beautiful wearable. There's something that goes over the mouth here, and then this wonderful costume. And we got 6 dancers to go through both Manchester and London city centres wearing the costumes. The costumes change colour with the gases of the air pollution. So as you go to traffic lights where your cars are stalling, the air pollution level rises, the costumes would change from this dramatic white to a bright red. And that would mean that the NO2 or the gas had actually increased. In this way, Invisible Dust makes the invisible visible. In this exhibition, I think that the 3 artists give people that broader view. The interesting thing with Bertinsky's work in particular is he gives that scale. It's quite difficult as an individual to understand what a coal mine is about. Suddenly you get that scale of his photographs and you can see the impact that it's having on our environment. So finally, what about making women's voices visible in climate change? Most of the scientists I work, they're fantastic scientists, but most of them are men. There's only a small number of women in science. Hopefully more in the future. More women are starting to study science, but certainly lots needs to be done in that. And so what we did in London is we organised something called Under Her Eye. Now, if anyone's Atwood's fans here, Margaret Atwood wrote about Under His Eye, so we subverted it into Under Her Eye. And we did a festival in the summer last year where Margaret Atwood spoke. We had Christiana Figueres, who was the UN climate chief for the Paris Agreement, a wonderful array of artists and scientists discussing climate change and getting that woman's voice heard. You talk about something like Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. We wanted that room for women to express their views on climate change. And the great thing for us is that's led to partnerships. We're now working with the United Nations Development Programme. And these internationally important organisations are starting to see the importance of artists in communicating climate change. So I just want to say I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this discourse about the Anthropocene with the National Gallery, bringing artists to the forefront of ideas and encouraging people to take action. We are creating visibility.
So that's great. Thank you to all of our invited guests. And one of the important kinds of aspects of this evening is to hear from you, the audience. So we want to hear what you have. You have questions. If you have anything you want to say, just get up. We'll get the mic to you, and you'll have your chance to talk with the guests or to the audience in general. And this is thrilling for me because as I was curating this exhibition, one of the things I realized that this is a very heavy topic. It's as Louis has so well put it this evening, it's something that can keep you up at night. And my feeling as a curator was that I just didn't want people leaving the exhibition going, oh, good grief, we can't do anything. Oh, the world's going to end. What's going to happen? I don't want that kind of response to the exhibition, obviously. So we have put together a whole bunch of events around this exhibition, and this is a very, very important one where it brings such interesting people with very interesting ideas to the table, and you too as guests of this kind of this evening. So. Why don't we start with something like, people have been talking about the relationship between art and science. If anyone out there has something they'd like to say about that, something they'd like to contribute, we'd love to hear from you. But we'd also like to hear some specific projects that some of the people here have been involved in. Does anybody want to jump in at this point? Louis or Alice or whomever? We all have to grab our microphones now.
So am I supposed to turn that on, or is it on?
It's on. It's on. Yep.
Just to mention that I'm in charge of the scientific program of the research icebreaker Amundsen. It's the one that is on the $50 bill. And as part of this scientific program, we have a small program which is Artist on Board, because we understood very early in the operation of the Amundsen that some of the best witnesses of what's going on in the Arctic. I wish I could take everybody, and especially the decision makers, to the Arctic to see what's going on, because there's no doubt about warming and changing landscapes and everything. You see the permafrost, you see the ice disappearing and everything. So we bring artists on board, writers, photographers, singers. We had Emily Claire Barlow, the jazz vocalist, and then they come back and they explain things, and people listen to them much more readily than they listen to scientists.
I can't think why. I think this is what we do really, and I think that there's so many things that an artist and a scientist working together can bring. I think one thing that's really important to say is it's not that the artist is doing a direct representation of the scientist's thoughts. I think that's really important to say, because sometimes when I first meet a scientist, I don't know if anyone knows about science, they do this thing called poster presentations. Has anyone heard about this? So it's like a poster, and then they have kind of diagram in the middle and some text. And very occasionally I meet a scientist who thinks that's what the artist is going to do for them, and I have to say, actually it's not going to be like that. It's not going to be a literal translation of the way that you're doing your particular, hydro flow of water is not going to be the way that the artist goes. They'll probably be very interested in the dye that you use in that water. So there's all sorts of angles that the artist comes at. And one of the most amazing scientist collaborations that I was going to mention is there's a writer called China Myville. He's a sci-fi writer. I don't know if anyone's sci-fi fans here. And he's an amazing guy. He's won sort of Arthur C. Clarke Awards and really sort of futuristic. And I met him, and he's an amazing looking guy. He's got tattoos down his arm. And I said, so China, what would you like to do with a scientist? And he said to me, I want to go into the deep sea. I want to go down below the light level in a submarine. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? How am I going to achieve this? Anyway, so I said to Alex Rogers, China Myville wants to go down into the deep sea in a submarine. And he said, oh yeah, we can do that. So we actually managed to get China down. Alex Rogers, the oceanographer, he's a marine biologist, came down in the other submarine. The two managed to talk together. They were talking about the wildlife and everything. And China wrote an amazing essay, and he's going to write a book about the experience. And so that's going to reach thousands, if not millions, of people around the world. And that's from one little conversation that he said to me. So there's amazing things that can come just from that first starting point of an artist and scientist collaboration.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it goes back to what you said earlier about invisibility. I think where art can really supplement science is that it can make visible through, visual art or literature, the outcomes and the changes that are still invisible to the human eye. And in that sense, I think it can be a precious addition to a world where the public doesn't necessarily, as you said, listen to scientists, but instead art has such a wide scope and a wide audience that it can really supplement science in that sense, I think.
I think it's right on, so you just have
is it on? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I suppose I have just two discrete things to add to that, which is that on a fundamental level, I just think it's absolutely necessary for us to work together. And particularly coming from my position within a university, I'm really interested in how we can transgress these boundaries and think about ways of building bridges and leveraging the cultures within our own disciplines to create more effective messages, if you like. And I think on a sort of, again, ostensible level, scientists are very good at creating meta-narratives. They're very good at communicating some of the sort of the broad aspects of this very dismal science, whereas artists can help provide a kind of complexity and subjectivity and maybe a kind of emotional underpinning that helps us have a more empathetic relationship with the science.
Right.
So in one sense, I think that kind of bridging is necessary. And on a second point, I've started to work with artists and scientists in the same exhibition space. So I've come across quite a few scientists like Christian and Noé Sade, who I just learned actually works with Louis on phytoplankton and diatoms. And they're very interested in making these minute, invisible, wonderful things that help us all breathe be visualized and identifiable. And I started to literally bring scientific imagery into exhibition spaces because I think, again, it's kind of it's an interesting gesture, if nothing else.
Yeah, right. Yes, there's questions.
Hi, thank you for being here and for presenting such hugely important work. So I'll get back to the marriage between art and science, but I'm really struck by Louis' 10 topics that will definitely keep me awake, not just tonight. Thank you, yes. And then the 5 phases, particularly on HCFCs, this idea that, well, we had a financial incentive to move away, and so that's not anything to really cheer about. We would have done it anyway, maybe. And then thinking about the other financial incentives that might get us to ratchet things back. And then in the context of what artists can do with visibility, I was just sort of brainstorming here with my friend and thinking about, well, if you have these 10 topics and 5 phases and an artist to help you paint through what that looks like, that would be really something, to have like a 50 vignette type demonstration. And the reason I say that is for the easy ones like HCFCs, we understand how that worked so well. Ocean acidification is something I can't see. I was at the Great Barrier Reef just before it was declared dead. And so, I'm curious about what it looks like to get to those points. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an extremely interesting suggestion, in fact, to bring those 50 steps, 5 for each of the 10 issues, to bring them alive, that is to illustrate them, or to, whether it's through pictures or graphic arts or sound or things like that, and bring them to the public. So, because as we said earlier, we live in kind of cocoons. We especially in the Western world, we live very comfortable lives and everything. And an exhibition like the Anthropocenes really shocks you into the reality of what we're doing to the planet. And you need a theme to start, and that Anthropocene theme is extremely powerful. But another theme like that could be developed is it's this idea of those 10 plagues, if you want, like in the Bible, the 10 plagues of. So to bring that through arts into the mind and the subconscious and the conscious of the people, I think it's a great idea. Yeah, let's start that tomorrow.
Okay, I think there was Monsieur.
What I have to say is probably more of an echo than a question. I mean, I'm looking at that picture behind you. And how many words would it take to describe what's going on there? And what would I see versus someone else? I mean, I'd see death. Someone else might see money.
Right.
So I think we're talking about complementary things here. I mean, a friend of mine sitting beside me said, if I could say it in words, I wouldn't have to paint it.
Right.
I wouldn't have to make a photograph. So I think we need that. We need that to educate people. We need to see the artist's work to describe what's going on. I mean, we can read it, and people don't believe what they read.
Right.
But I think it's more convincing when you see a picture. There's something wrong in that picture.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's an interesting kind of, it's a suggestion, and I think I really like this idea of, well, there's something that we can see, as you say, that incites us to some kind of thinking or action or whatever. But then there's all kinds of other ways of perhaps feeling or experiencing the subject under discussion. Like, I think, Selena, were you talking a little bit about that? Like how you can have this kind of, like, there's two ways of dealing with this. There might be a way of, the idea of, like you were calling boots on the ground, and then there was this idea of having a little bit more of a longer-term relationship with some of the issues that are at on display in the exhibition.
I can't remember what my original point was, but I'm sure I have something to say.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's something like, okay, we've got this incredible photograph, and it hits us powerfully. But then there's other kinds of ways.
Got it. Well, in a sense, there is a particular kind of language that's within the Batinsky and Co. exhibition, which can literally take your breath away. I think we can all agree. It can kind of close you down because it's so damning and so difficult to digest. And I left there feeling a little like I don't know where to go from here, and I don't know how to think and act politically, perhaps. And I see a similar kind of conversation happening in a lot of different contexts, including conferences, where on the one hand there is this absolute desire for how do we come together and create action and change? How do we go from these sorts of systems of representation to then doing something in the world? And at the other spectrum, how do we keep hold of the complexity that's required? Because it isn't just a conversation about climate change; it's also about people, and it isn't a universal message. The Anthropocene affects people very differently in the global south to the north, for example, along gender lines. So it's an incredibly complex conversation that needs to be had. So how do we come up with ways of, if you like, maintaining constant critical dialogue that's open and, if you like, as democratic and egalitarian as possible, and offers agency, with something that's also about how do we work together, and how do we work together in such a way that it pushes actual, if you like, political change.
Right, yes, exactly.
I thought it was interesting in the Batinsky that, sorry, we've got two questions.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I'll just jump in. Thank you so much for making that statement that this is a complex problem. I think that's a very, very relevant statement. As a grandmother and a mother, so thankful for events like this and bringing together minds to discuss this. As an engineer, I'm all about risk management before problems get so expensive and are so difficult and impossible to control. One of the things in engineering with change management, which is the people side of change, is you're looking at, in order, trying to influence awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And you have to move through each of those in sequence. I think you're doing a brilliant job of raising awareness, and the scientific community and the artistic community through these exhibitions are doing that more and more. It's the desire piece. How do we push past that to raise the critical level of awareness or of desire to make these changes? And so I'm just wondering, are you seeing, and you were alluding to this, infiltration more and more into political spheres to affect change, into industry spheres to affect change?
Well, maybe I can try and briefly explain what ArcticNet we're doing. So we've been studying the Arctic and see what's going on, and we're trying to reach to the policymakers at all levels, that is, in the level of the communities in the north, in the level of the provincial and federal government, and internationally as well. And one way that we devised to mobilize knowledge into action is through what we call the, I don't want to get too technical, but stop me if I get too boring, but it's called the Integrated Regional Impact Study, IRISes. So we divided the Canadian Arctic maritime Arctic, the Inuit Nunangat, that is the country of the Inuit, we divided it into 4 sub-regions. And for each of those regions, we developed an assessment which is based first in 7 steps, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. First, you consult with the people. You ask them, what's the problem you see? What are you afraid of? What are your concerns and everything? Then you find out what is missing as far as information is concerned, and if there are gaps, you fill them by doing the research. You fund the research and you do the research. Then you combine that knowledge with trends, climatic trends, but also economic trends and health trends. And you say, here's what we think is going to happen in 25, 50, or 100 years from now. And here's how you could prepare for it in the north. And once you reach that, you publish the assessment, you try to come, and that's one of the most difficult part, which we would publish books, that thick, all written in lay terms, in lay language, but nobody would read that or whatever. So now we're putting it on the web. That is, you can go on the web, and soon you will be able to ask your question, to connect with the specialist directly. And we're trying to reach policymakers and people that take decisions about that. And then you start it all over. That is, once you're finished with that, you start from scratch, because new issues have built up in the meantime and everything. So it's an iterative process, and this is how we're trying to reach because we learn very quickly that you cannot transform a policymaker into a scientist. You can take a scientist screaming and kicking from his or her ivory tower, bring them down and make them speak like normal people, so that they can explain what's going on. Excuse me, been a bit long.
I think quite a lot in culture that actually artists do lead things that are changing. A good example in London, when I first set up Invisible Dust, was that we worked on air pollution, which is where we got the name from, Invisible Dust. And we were campaigning away, it was probably around 2012. Now, Sadiq Khan, who's the Labour mayor the last 2 years, air pollution has been one of his top political agendas, and if you do surveys now in London, air pollution comes above violent crime, it comes above really, really important issues for people in local areas. It's become the thing that people are really caring about. They are knowing it's affecting health, they're knowing it's connected to climate change. So I think that it's not to say that we caused it, but we're part of that catalyst of that change. And I think having really big events and we did quite a lot of public art events as well as exhibitions, and getting those messages out there, getting people talking about it, has been part of a change.
And there were other questions out there? Yep, a whole bunch of them.
Oh, right.
Okay, sir?
Thank you very much. This is fascinating and very important, so thank you very much indeed. My question maybe goes down underneath some of, at least, of what has been talked about so far. I was interested that Louis made reference to the priests and and of course I'm not here to defend the nasty things that happened. One of the things, though, that lies behind that is a question of relationship, and where I'm heading is to ask what you think humanity today thinks of its relationship with nature. Are we part of nature? Do you think that humanity generally today thinks of itself as a part of nature? We spent part of last summer, my wife and I, in the Arctic, met a number of Canadian Inuit and went to Greenland as well and saw some people there. One of the things that struck us was that they have no doubt, the Inuit, they're part of nature. Nature is part of them. There is a totally intimate connection. So recognizing the importance of what's happening around them is in a way easier. It's still part of them. And I think getting into the artistic side is a first step, or maybe a first 10 steps. But I'm wondering if you could comment on this question of the relationship with nature, because really that underlies a lot of what we're talking about, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question that you're raising about our relationship with nature. I don't think there's one single answer. I think everyone obviously has a very different relationship to nature, but I think much of the modern era and much of our personal psyches are built upon the idea that we can escape our natural fate and our mortality in particular, and much of what we do, what we pursue in terms of technology, aims, for example, transhumanism, aims at sort of separating ourselves from nature, and because it's such a painful thing to realize that you're, just a natural being, and that you're not, even though you're capable of such sophisticated, brilliant thought, you're really at the end of the day just, another mortal creature, if you will. So I think that's really interesting. And another thing that your comment made me think about is that I think people who live those very urbanized lifestyles that we live today have a very, decreased relationship with nature. We don't have that many occasions of interacting with it, and it makes it only easier to forget just how related we are and how dependent we are upon nature. It's very easy to not, see a tree in a year, and to, completely ignore and forget that there is such a thing as nature. And I think that really, only helps you think you've liberated yourself from nature, which of course, in this, I probably explain why so many people are impervious to everything that we hear about climate change.
Maybe that's such a hugely important point, and it's so central to the heart of everything that we're talking about. And obviously, it's so complex. I'm not going to address everything, except to say that clearly in Western society, our, if you like, relationship with nature has shrunk. It falls very much on class lines in terms of who can afford to have a garden, who has access to parks and forests and so forth. But I also think of instances like the airing of Blue Planet 2 and the fact that apparently 15 or 16 million people watch Blue Planet 2 in the UK. And it has a very particular visual language, doesn't it? It is very much about beauty and wonder and the desire for reconnection. And I think it's it was a very kind of powerful aesthetic. And in the UK, after that aired, there was a completely different conversation about ocean plastics and an actual kind of movement towards political change as a result, which simply demonstrates the fact that I think people really care. I don't think we've just kind of emotionally let go and we're all in this existential crisis. I think it's just late capitalism has enforced it upon us. And there are these interesting spaces that kind of allow for reconnection. And again, I think exhibitions can do that. I'll also say that there is a really fantastic exhibition over at Carleton University Art Gallery right now with Christy Belcourt, which is very much about this Indigenous perspective, and very important Indigenous perspective that you raised there. And I encourage you to go and see a kind of counterpoint to the Anthropocene.
Yeah, we're actually focusing on biodiversity in a big way, and particularly because, I don't know where the guy's gone, who asked the question, oh there you are, you're moved, but particularly because of what you're talking about. We identified the crisis in biodiversity, the next, they call it the sixth extinction of animals, to be the absolute most important thing we need to address for the next few years. So we're doing an exhibition called In Our Nature, which is going to be all exactly on what we're talking about, humans' relationship with nature, how species are thriving or not thriving. One other reason I think for looking at biodiversity is there are good messages as well as bad. And one of the things that we've been talking about is, the doom and gloom of the list. Actually, populations of animals can recover if the right action is taken. So I think that's another thing that's important in that, because there are ways we can save species, there's ways we can recover species. So I think that's really important. The other thing I think is really important about nature is the discussion about young people. And young people aren't going out to play the way that they used to. Certainly in the UK, they're not. They're using computers more and phones, and that's not going to change. But a lot of them are not going out because of it. They're not going out into nature, into the woods, kids in the way that they did when I was young or you were young, and that's a big change. And I think one of the things we want to do is reach out to young people, maybe through an unconventional way, for example, coding clubs or something they are interested, and then through that get them out into nature, getting them out to do trips and bringing that back into, maybe they'll use the computers as part of exploring nature. That's not a problem. We've just got to make sure people do have the connection. And as we all know, children actually love animals. There's a real, that love for animals is still there. I just think that at the moment the children aren't getting the access to it. So that is the future, that those guys need to be the ones that love nature. We've created a mess for them, but they're going to be the ones inheriting it. So I think it's really important to get young people involved in this.
Exactly. Yes. There's a question over there.
Hi. Thank you very much, all of you. And thank you to the gentleman who asked the question about nature. He sort of provided an introduction for what I want to say. I think there are two things that are so important and that need to be addressed. Well, one of them is education. As a teacher and a writer and aware of what's on the curriculum across the country, the environment is in the curriculum as a unit. And it always makes me kind of, smile and laugh, because the environment is not a unit, it's everything. Thus, and I mean, this has been going on for like decades in the curriculum. And there are things that occur, but there's no great focus. And actually, everything else, and I'm sure people in this room, think this too, there's really nothing else if we don't have the planet, as I don't need to convince you people, you're convincing all of us, but it's amazing to me that it's not threading its way through everything as the theme. It doesn't matter whether you're teaching math, English, history, science, or what. It all comes together. It's interesting, you were talking earlier about, art and science. I mean, they're really just, two sides of the coin, actually. And then I wanted to mention, in all my years of teaching, and I would give my students a choice of a poem after we'd gone through many of them. I taught at De La Salle for many years. And one of the poems I would teach them and then give them the choice on an exam to examine one of the poems. They inevitably, 97 or 98% of them would go to this poem by Wordsworth, 1802, "The world is too much with us." And in terms of the relationship between man and nature, I mean, poets have been going on about this for a long time, but the Romantic poets, Keats, Byron, Shelley, etc., but particularly Wordsworth, talked about it in a way that this poem, "The world is too much with us," could have been written yesterday morning. And rather than go on too much longer, I would just like to say the opening lines of the poem and their relevance, which is 100%. And it was written in 1802. Well, he may have written it earlier, but that's when it was published. So he writes, Wordsworth, the great nature poet, he writes, "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given away our hearts." And, teaching kids in this generation, this poem, written 217 or published 217 years ago, resonated with them. And when I see what's going on with the curriculum, I'll be back in Toronto in a couple of months going over this stuff again with them. But when I see, when I listen to you guys, all of you, and I've seen the film Anthropocene, and I'm, trying to keep up with it. And then I look at the curriculum, and if our children are not, and our grandchildren and their children, if it's not too late, if we're not doing more educationally, what are we doing? It's wonderful that the artists, of whom I am one myself, and the poets and the chansonniers, the singers and the scientists are doing this, but we have to start this in pre-kindergarten. It has to start in the home, but I don't mean to sound like I'm preaching here. I'm being way too didactic, I know, but if it doesn't start in the classrooms and it doesn't start in the homes, we're simply not going to get there. And the 10 points, I won't sleep tonight, I promise. Just in honor of those points, which, by the way, I would like to access because I couldn't hear them all, so maybe you'll tell me later where I can get onto a website where I can review that. But anyway, to conclude, I just wanted to say that for hundreds of years, and especially the poet Wordsworth, wrote about man's relationship to nature in ways that are so superior to anything we could think right now or say or do, and that if we're not doing more with our children in our curriculum, and we're not, I know it's on the curriculum, we're not doing it, then I don't know how we can hope to accomplish. It has to be within the system. I'm pretty sure you'd agree with that, but or you can comment.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I have a little comment. I could quote another poet saying, "How do you know that every bird that cuts its airy way is an immense world of delight closed to your senses 5?" And to me, Blake very much pointed out this incredible kind of divide between human and nature, being that we think somehow nature is separate from us, but it is an immense world of delight. So there's this idea that, that grew up in kind of Western philosophy, that nature is kind of like that, just there for us to use and mold to our own ends. But it has a way of connecting back to us in various ways, and certainly through the arts. It's one kind of channel for discovery. Does anybody else want to comment on the?
I guess that whole relationship of Indigenous communities with nature is something that we discussed when we walked around the exhibition, because it doesn't come through very strongly in that exhibition. It's a very good exhibition about the Anthropocene. It's not necessarily an Indigenous perspective on climate change, and I think it'd be really interesting to have Indigenous peoples, First Nation peoples, Aboriginals, going round that exhibition and hearing their interpretation of those photographs that they can see, because the effects are so devastating, but actually below that you've got layers and layers of people who are affected and their whole communities and their lives, but also the way they feel about nature is intrinsic to them as well. So there's not that separation. In Western societies, even if we love nature, that it is more separate. If you're brought up in a Inuit community, nature is part of you and is part of your heritage. The land is part of you. So I think that perspective is really interesting to explore further.
I think I'll add a little something. Has anyone heard of a Swedish school student called Greta Thunberg? She's a phenomenon. Just when you thought that perhaps, everything's going dark and there's no hope, there is this extraordinary young girl, she's 15 or 16, who started to initiate these school strikes for climate change. And I read today that something like 30,000 school students are striking in Belgium today. So it's not small numbers either, and she's gaining major kind of, she has an international platform now, and she's not scared to get up to those politicians and say, you are behaving childishly. It's absolutely extraordinary. So that for me is it's the first kind of semblance of hope that I've recognized in a while.
Yep, sure. Anybody? Yes, we've got, question?
Hello, sorry. Firstly, thanks to the panel. I just had two quick things. One, I wanted to say to Marie, did you have anything in terms of your poetry that you would care to gift to us?
Please do.
And then after that, quickly, and is maybe not quickly, but Louis, you touched on population, which I think is probably one of the key things as the race of humans that we have to deal with. Is there something that science can give us to move forward with in terms of population? But first, is there some poetry that you can bring?
Not working.
Thank you for your interest in my work. I don't know any of my work by heart. which I realize now is probably a problem.
We could pull it up.
Oh, God.
Yes, no.
Well, actually, the thing is, I've not yet written much about anything related to what we're writing about today, and I think most of my work, especially when it comes to poetry, is mostly about what it's like to be a woman in a world that is very, hostile to women. So, in this sense, it's not exactly related to the Anthropocene. But what I thought about earlier when someone in the audience said, why are we not addressing, because if there's no planet, then there's nothing else. So in a sense, this is the problem that we should address first. And I still think that, there are many other ongoing issues, such as the ones that I address in my poetry about, gender dynamics and everything that are also, everything should be sort of handled at the same time. So this isn't a very poetic answer. I apologize for it, but there.
Can I say a poem?
Yes, of course you can, Louis.
Souvenez-vous l'objet que nous vîmes, mon âme, ce beau matin d'été si doux. Une charogne infâme sur un lit de cailloux. La puanteur était si forte que vous crûtes vous évanouir. Le soleil rayonnait sur cette pourriture comme afin de la cuire à point et de rendre au centuple à la grande nature tout ce qu'ensemble elle avait joint. De noirs bataillons de larves montaient et descendaient. Anyway, it goes on like that forever. But this is from Baudelaire. It's called Une charogne, a carrion. Yep. And the part that I like is the black battalions of larvae moving up and down on the thing. Because, and I'll come back to the population, but it's linked to that. At this time, for an ecologist like me, there's no difference in the demographic curve of humanity, of our species. It goes as an S, it goes very low. For our species is about 300,000 years old. So for a very long time, we were way beyond, below 1 million. And then in 1840, we reached the first billion. In 1960, we reached 3 billions. And in November 2012, we reached 7 billions. And it's going like that. So this is what you were asking. Now, the United Nations, they think that, as I said earlier, that we're going to reach 11 billion people. So we're like the larvae climbing. And for an ecologist, the development of bacteria on, I don't know, in the summertime, you put a stake in the parking lot and you watch the bacteria develop. It's going to be exactly the same. It's going to start low and then it's going to explode and then it's going to reach a peak and then, paf, it's going to crash when there's no more meat. And at this time, unfortunately, again, for all of us, there's no difference between the curve that I described for the population rising and that of bacteria on a stake in a parking lot in the summertime.
There you go.
So this is to answer your question, what can we say at this time? At this time, we haven't seen yet the inflection point. That is a point when it starts to slow down in the increase. We hope, some specialists think that we're going to reach the peak and then that it's going to hopefully not crash so much but go down by mid-century. So it's going to be in between these two things. And at this time, the way that the structure of the population is, I'll try to explain it to you very brief. Can you hold this for me?
Whoop, there goes the...
That was a good catch. So the structure of the population is we have 2 billion people out of the 7.5 billion that have the age of reproducing. So they produce 2 other billion people. See, 2 blocks, 2 other, that's 4 billion people. Those 2 billion people, younger people, they have the right to reproduce. So they will probably produce 2 billion people, maybe, hopefully a little less than that. That's going to be 6 billion people. And then all the old people, like me, the old farts and everything, that will survive and that will age, get to live longer because of all the progress and everything. All of that will push us to 11 billion people by 2100 years. So this is what the, thank you, Maria. This is what the demographers are telling us, those of the United Nations. Now, there are different interpretations of the situation, and we hope that we'll be able to maybe peak at 9 billion by 2050, and then we will start to decrease. What's going to be extremely important for our civilization, if we want to survive that tidal wave of humanity, is to learn how to manage negative growth and manage decreasing population. Because at this time, our society, there's only one thing we know how to do, is to grow. No growth, no profit, no fun. So we have to find a new way to manage negative growth. And the ecologists, the human ecologists and the ecologists in general, most of them think that our population should stabilize around 500 millions if we want to leave enough space for other species, and at the same time live a full life as a civilization. That is, to have all the technological developments that will make us happy, will make everybody on the planet happy. For everyone on the planet to be happy, we need to be fewer. Doesn't mean that we're going to start shooting everybody with machine guns. No, but we have to plan our demography and to bring it down. We made an experiment. We didn't want to make it. It's just like bacteria on the steak. They have no choice but to grow. We should try in the future not to be like bacteria. Excuse me, another conference.
The worldwide recognition is the way of reducing population is to educate young women. So actually that's a much more straightforward suggestion. So any young women from, in many developing countries drop out of school, aren't encouraged to stay at education from about 12 onwards. If you find that the education level goes up, which obviously is a great thing for society, a great thing for those young women, you also find that the birth rate goes down. So that's something that UNESCO's got a massive policy on birth rate. So I just think that it's important to recognise there are things you can do about it, and very positive things.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
I wanted to say, I think the big issue about climate change and
you're right.
and the public is simple things like I heard today on the radio Don Drummond talking about the fact in Ontario they were going to charge, or they have charged 4 cents a litre less for gas. And what struck me when he said that is they're cutting out education for kindergartens for young people, and it's getting the message across that these things all relate. And I look at France with the strikes over gas prices. I mean, how do you deal with the economic side of things so that people can really understand it and its relationship to climate change? Because I think that's the heart of the issue, is getting at the economic thing, so that people want it for themselves and for their children.
I think in a very simple sense, I think we have to pressure our politicians to separate themselves from fossil industries, because right now they're clearly, it's like two sides of the same coin. Because we can't, I think some of these protests that are happening and responses, it's like we're trying to punish the poor and say you have to pay for the climate change that these companies have created. So it must be a political thing that we have to resolve, which is not easy, but...
Yes, quite. Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, hello. I feel so honored to be able to speak here, as like a lot of panelists mentioned about young women. So I'm not speaking for like the whole entire young women. It's like no. Actually, I want to ask the scientists in the panel like a question. You must have heard the theory that women, we as a species, were like a virus that Earth caught. The way we're just multiplying and multiplying, and we're hurting our host, and now all the climate change is like all the hurricanes and like disaster is a way for us to like, man, my immune system have to like start working, I have to get rid of these viruses. So I'm just thinking, sorry, was that me? Sorry. Okay. Maybe like as humans, it will be the best for the Earth and other species if we just slowly die out.
Okay, who wants to go for that one?
Oh, and just one more thing. A lot of people mention without this planet, where will we go? This is a new trend, like extraplanetary colonization. You know, is this new thing. I know we feel uncomfortable about it, or like Earth is our home. But what if this is the future? You know, if we think about it rationally. I guess my question is, why should we care? Like, what if this is like the nature, how it runs its course?
Yeah, the question was asked to the scientist.
Okay, look.
So this brings us back to the question that the gentleman here asked.
Whoa, what is that, please?
What's our relationship as a species to nature? Is Homo sapiens, are we part of nature? So there are many answers to that. It's been a big question. You know, Aristotle had his idea. Werner Heisenberg has his other ideas in quantum physics. But if we come back to the Inuit people, you said they are very close to nature. They live off the land, they live off the sea and everything. They are much closer to nature than we are as Western people living in the modern world. But they are much less. They are much more removed from nature than they were in yesteryears, when they didn't have guns and they didn't have skidoos and they didn't have helicopters and things like that. And if you go back in time again, when humanity didn't have spears and weapons and everything, we were much closer to nature, in the sense that nature would eat us sometime, and instead of us destroying nature. And to come back to what I was about to, if I had the opportunity to answer your question at that time, what I was about to say is that when is it that we are in that progression towards modernity and technology? Where is it that we are no more part of nature? And in other words, when, for example, is a cancer in an organism or a body, when is the cancer no more part of the body and exists on itself and is creating the havoc? And this is the answer to your question. You know, we're like a disease. We're like a cancer. I know it's not fun to hear that. You know, you wish you would be a tiger or a polar bear or even a polar cod. In my case, this is what my dream. But or a copepod. But where is it, you know, where is that transition, subtle transition, when we're no more part of nature, where what is killing nature? But then, if you go back 2.2 billion years ago, were cyanobacteria wondering, are we still part of nature now that we're, you know, decimating all other forms of life? Who knows? After the havoc, the problems, the terrible footprint that we left on the planet, maybe something else than us will take the... Anyway, this is part of science fiction, but there are so many things in science fiction that we see happening these days. It could be
So do other panelists or guests here have...
I just wanted to, the lady who asked a very good question at the front, it sort of relates to that, I think, in a way, which is we do have the resources to make a massive change. The problem about the resources at the moment, they're going into consumer goods, and, you know, our society is all about buying things and being consumers, and it's not popular with any company to say don't buy things. And actually, what do we want to do? We have to, in the West, we do have to go down in terms of our consumption, because as everyone knows, in the global South, people are starving, so they have to go up. Look at the two sides of the scale. If the poor countries, people have to increase their standards of living, so they're not starving, then they're going to have to increase their GDP, they're going to have to increase their carbon footprint. We have got to go down. There's no great, you know, maths to this. This is what we've all got to do. And I think that the problem is that the resources at the moment are going towards, as Selena mentioned, the fossil fuel industry, but actually we can do something about it. There is electric cars. In fact, every car manufacturer throughout the world are all looking at electric cars now. It's not just one company, everybody's looking at it. There is renewables. If we really put the finance and the investment into renewables, we could do it. And there's an interesting picture right at the end of the exhibition where there's the goodwill, you know, the good news messages. There's the solar power, the wind power. The one in the middle, the lithium batteries. People see that one with the blue sort of photographs. Batteries, now there is something called graphene. I don't know if people have heard about graphene. Graphene conducts electricity much, much more powerfully than anything you can imagine. And in the future, your whole heating system in your house could be graphene. So there are things that people are inventing that can completely transform the way we waste things, the way we take on too many things. So there are some really powerful things that we could be doing. The problem is the resources are not going into them at the moment. In the UK, for example, they've cut subsidies to solar power. People were putting them on their roofs. Now we do have much more sunny weather than we used to because of climate change. It could be a really big investment of the government, and they've actually cut it, so it's not happening. Right. So it's a political will thing.
Celia.
I've forgotten what the original question is, sorry, but I just wanted to kind of follow off on that a little bit, which is that I think there may be a tipping point quite soon, actually, amongst governments who literally can't afford to sweep up the mess of climate change. Climate change is going to start costing a lot of money. We've learned a lot about that with the California fires of late, and I think that might be the kind of leverage point where there is this kind of turn in culture away from these relationship with fossil industries. Second thing which is a bit about the youth question, which is, I suppose I have a question for the younger people in the audience, and it's a little bit to do with the fact that this era of the Anthropocene seems to have a phase in it called the Great Acceleration, and all of the scientific statistics seem to be about the last 40 years. The last 40 years, population increased, global warming increased dramatically, biodiversity halved in the last 40 years. So how do those 19, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds amongst you feel about that? In other words, this is a hugely intergenerational issue, and we're being told by the IPCC that we have 12 years to put a cap on global warming before things completely get catastrophic.
Another question? Oh, okay. Oh, good, great, go for it. But the mic... How does it?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this amazing discussion. I am a political science student at Carleton University, and these issues that we discussed today, I really understand how they're going to affect my loved ones, my next generation, which I will possibly produce. And I really wish that the decision makers of not only this country, but all countries of the world could visit this exhibition and see what the consequences are. And my question to you is, to all of you, maybe to people in the audience, how do we make sure people not only in the democratic and liberal countries, but people in the less developed countries, how do we make sure that our voices are heard? And do I have to go and vote for the Green Party, or do I have to go and sign the numerous petition on the Change.org, or how can I ensure that my voice is heard? Thank you.
Anybody want to tackle that?
I guess in lots of different ways, and I think you've got to start from your personal viewpoints. So if you're somebody who feels passionate about the wildlife and animals in your area, go and join up to a group that supports the wildlife and that kind of thing. If you're somebody who really wants to do something about, something national like energy, you can get involved in groups that are campaigning on some of those. So I just think you've got to find what's right for you, and there's lots of different ways. And obviously there are things you can do in your own personal life. I mean, recycling is an obvious one, but there's other things you can do to, change your life in terms of not doing so much air travel, those kind of things. So I think it's a difference between your sort of personal position in terms of your own domestic things, and then more sort of things you can get involved in politically. And I think it's just deciding what's right for you. And some people have more time at some points, and some people don't have time at other points. I mean, I think that Selena's point as well is that there's a lot of, I don't know about here, but in the UK there's a lot of problems with depression in universities, and a lot of people are getting depressed. And I wonder actually whether climate change is one of the reasons that students are finding it difficult, because it is very overwhelming. One of the things when we were going through the exhibition, me and Selena were saying, you do feel quite overwhelmed by this, and actually we've got to find some very practical and personal ways of people feeling strong about it. being with other groups, other people chatting about it. I mean, the climate strikes is a great example. They're actually, you can go online, you can see these organisation meetings with all these kids from all the different schools all coming together and brainstorming on boards. They're only about 14. They're fantastic, aren't they? They're really amazing. And I think if young people can do that, then, certainly us as older people. And I think it's just about finding which areas you can do things yourself. I think that's the important thing. And I'm hoping that artists enable young people to do that as well, because it is a more open way. The other thing is to say we're a terribly visual culture now because of our phones, which, there's some crazy statistic about how much we look at our phones a day, isn't there? Incredible. So visual artists are particularly important, I'd say, with climate change, because it's going to be the images. I mean, as the guy said behind with the image of Bertinsky, it's going to be the images that make people change. Yeah, so become an artist as well.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, everybody should be. Marie?
I think that we tend to wonder a lot about why states aren't necessarily taking the right steps to mitigate climate change, but we tend to forget that states generally have a lousy track record of solving or handling or even recognizing the issue. And I think there's an issue of scale here, and that we're so convinced that states are the actual most relevant scale to handle this problem at, and I think that's not necessarily true. For example, if you look at the issue of climate change, cities have a particularly important role to play. We tend to think as individuals that our individual action amounts to so little that it's not worth taking. I think there's a lot of thought to be given to what smaller scales can do, like sub-state scales, particularly cities in that sense.
Well, my question is a really nice segue to all these comments. So I have to say, the first time I went through the exhibit, I was so depressed. Mm-hmm. I was intending to see the movie, and I thought, I can't go see the movie.
No, you must.
And I have full disclosure. I have to say that I have 5 children. Sorry, Pierre. But 3 of them are scientists, and all of them are artists. So that's very helpful. But my question is, because I really believe in the power of one, and I would like to hear from all of the panelists, including our curator, about 1 or 2 suggestions that each of us could do as an individual, maybe something we hadn't thought about yet, to make a difference.
Do I start? Oh, okay. Well, I can only really come from kind of a personal experience about my own kind of values in the world, which is to pay attention and to appreciate what's in front of you and to just marvel at the complexity of the natural world in for my own kind of experience and what that presents to you, and to do in as little way possible. Say, for example, I'm a birder, so I really appreciate birds and I really want to pay attention to them, and I'm not really interested in, counting how many different kinds of birds I can, but I am interested in looking at that one particular bird on my bird feeder, for example, and just really paying attention, and then doing what I can to help preserve the habitat for that bird. So that's my own personal kind of way of dealing with this much, much larger issue that if I really started to think about it every day, I wouldn't get out of bed. So that's just my contribution. Marie?
I think a possible solution is to do exactly what we're doing here today, is bring together people with different experiences and areas of expertise and have them discuss the issues together and no longer think about this in a very siloed sort of way. And the second thing I would say is that we're very much relying now on new technologies and very much ignoring their impact on nature. And because we're so focused on, for example, I don't know, like the amount of paper we're going to be able to save by, doing things numerically or anything, and no one really stops. We're not really aware, and we're not told much about the sort of ecological impact of our use of new technologies. I think, reflecting on that is also very interesting.
I'm a scientist, so I'm supposed to be apolitical, so I'm not supposed to have answers to that. But I think it's an engineering. Everybody has to contribute and everything. As we said earlier, there is so much that as individuals you can do. You can have a lifestyle that will be as clean as possible if you want. But the solution resides in the big transformation of our civilization, and you have to start as an individual. You can start as if you're rich, you disinvest in oil and gas assets, and increasingly people are doing that, and insurance companies are doing that, and pension funds are doing that, and this is where it really has traction. As we mentioned earlier, moving from subsidies to oil and gas, and towards subsidies to renewable energy. That's one thing to do, and also and all the issues that we have. Let's take plastic in the ocean, for example. It's a big deal. It's a big thing. But plastic in the ocean, 80% of it comes from 8 rivers in Asia. This is where you have to focus the issue about it. Find the engineering solution. Just an example: the fleet that fish in the ocean is 5 times too large for what the ocean can provide as fish. Take 80% of that fleet and turn them into fisher for plastic. And pay them to pull out plastic from the ocean. It's engineering things like that. It's to think out of the box and move out of the normal ways of doing things. And maybe we have a little chance to avoid the worst. The plan, the roadmap has been defined in Paris 3 years ago, and we have to stick to it. We're not, but we have to stick to it.
I guess because I'm not a scientist and I don't have a technological solution to any of this, I'd just like us to change the culture of our consumption. I think we just need to move away from single-use plastic, single-use everything, fast fashion. Probably need to start to learn to grow our own food, at least a little bit, gesture at it, thrift more. When I want to remind myself about how incredibly over-consumerist I am, all I have to do is visit my 82-year-old dad, who was obviously born in the 30s and is incredibly frugal, as that generation was. There are things all over his house that are 40, 50 years old, and he wouldn't literally dream of changing something just because grey is in fashion this year, kind of thing. So I think we can learn from that pre-plastic generation and that frugal generation, and I think we dramatically need to change our culture of consumption.
It's interesting, I was trying to think, so I think I'm a real believer in technology. I think technology is really important, but I actually think what's happening now is we're becoming a generation that are completely dominated by our phones. And what I'm trying to do with my kids, which has involved me in huge amounts of battles, is to get them to turn their phones off and actually have time where the phone is off. So my kind of advice is to turn the phone off and then go for a walk. Don't take your phone with you. The amount of people I see, they're out on a beautiful walk. I live in Scarborough, by the sea, and they take their phones. They end up talking to their friend. They're not actually taking in the sea, the landscape, the air, everything else. We are so wedded to our phones. And with things like AI coming for the future, I feel quite scared, because I think that we have to be strong in ourselves for these future things that are going to happen to our world. AI could be brilliant, but it also could be very threatening to how we feel as human beings. Read about it, because we all need to know about it. And I just think to actually switch off, to read a book, sounds old-fashioned, listen to some music you love, and just be with yourself, I'd say, is what I think is really important.
Perfect. We have another question in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. We're incredibly privileged to be here in this beautiful gallery, sipping wine and having wonderful snacks in this gorgeous place. And I think that's one of the issues. I want to make a challenge to the artists and the scientists here, because that's what we're trying to marry here. And 3 things. I think we need to find allies as artists and scientists to bring this message to the wider world. And I think one of the first allies is Indigenous peoples, because really they're doing more work than we are. and we really owe a lot to them in terms of the Idle No More movement, or opposition to pipelines because of treaties in unsettled treaties, etc., and across British Columbia, etc. So those are our natural allies as environmental artists and scientists. Second thing, I think that, and this is related to the privilege, I think that the message needs to go to the people. So it's wonderful to have exhibits in the National Gallery, but I love the idea of bringing the art to the street and bringing the art to the people in all sorts of ways. And I think that's the challenge, because it's the masses out there that need to hear this message, not the privileged, not us privileged. We're just too privileged, and we hear it over and over again, and we hear the message, you know, the earth is effed. That's what we're hearing, and that leads me to my third challenge, is that because of that incredibly depressing message, we need messages of hope. And I think the young people and the Indigenous peoples and the people in the street and the masses, they need to hear the messages of hope. So as scientists, I think you already know you're not doing anything. You're not convincing anybody, not in the Republican Party or in, you know, Trump supporters, et cetera, through the science, you see? So I think that we need to hear messages of hope through art and science, so that we can change, so that we can, exactly what you've been touching on, about little things that we can do despite our governments and despite industry and despite Facebook and Amazon and pipelines, etc. So those are my three challenges to you as artists and scientists. I think that I'm really hopeful that that's where change lies.
Does anybody want to respond, or no? Yeah, okay. Okay. Is there another question out there? Oh, sorry. I have to follow the hand gestures over.
A bit as a follow-up to the previous statement of governments being less dependent on fossil fuels for profit. I'm curious to know your views on the most significant challenges you face as artists, activists, in your professional lives in making tangible change happen. What are the biggest holdups, and what are some of the feasible solutions to those issues?
To answer your question very generally, when I conducted the research project that I was talking about asylum seekers and their housing in German and Swedish cities, one of the things that we noticed is that stakeholders of all sorts, and particularly cities, don't talk to each other about the challenges and the solutions and anything at all. And they didn't know, for example, at the time Berlin didn't know of a very popular solution that Hamburg had put into place and that everyone was discussing. And I think really one of the challenges is to have more communication about the solutions, what works, what doesn't work, and to just, you know, sort of communicate and share more about those things.
Alice?
Hello. My one, I guess, is actually about getting the contemporary art world, which is where I am. I work with contemporary artists, to take on board that this is something where sometimes I'm accused of the artist being instrumental about something because they're taking up a political issue. And I think that there's a real need for people to realise that artists are artists. They have ideas about everything in the world, and why not have something about climate change? It doesn't mean that they're being instrumental in their art. They're actually got as high quality artworks as anyone else. But particularly in the UK, and I don't know whether it's the same in Canada, a lot of the art world is directed towards the market now, for selling the work. And there's an event called Frieze, and I think I'm a Frieze art fair, and a lot of artists make work for that art fair. And the problem is that means they're not making art that they want to make. They're making it because they know it's going to be bought by a certain collector. And that, I think, is a really big problem in the art world. And so I guess that's something I come across, is that sometimes when I'm talking to people, rather than realising the value of what we're doing, you hit that block because you're not working with X artist who's about to be showing in Frieze next year, you know.
Yeah, right. And Selena, would you have something to say with Ephemeral Coast and some of the projects that you've been...
Sure.
Yeah. I guess one of my professional challenges is actually using this position of privilege, and it is privilege in capital letters really, to try and garner the kind of interdisciplinarity that I think is really necessary for the question at hand, i.e., working with scientists, working with philosophers, having a kind of leveling effect when universities are incredibly hierarchical, so that can be a real challenge in and for itself. And also in terms of like the actual curation of the shows, I have sort of two twin problems. One, I'm really interested in local places where art doesn't necessarily have a strong voice, like there aren't major art galleries and this kind of thing. So I'm looking for ways of having events and having a cultural voice there in a meaningful way. So I'm thinking about social media. I've been using film for the first time. I'm thinking about dissemination in different kinds of ways. And I'm also really thinking about my carbon footprint. Is that travel worth it? I don't work with artists in the sense that I move objects around the world anymore. I work a lot with performance artists, with video art. So I am thinking much more carefully about these questions of carbon footprint. Rambling answer, but...
Yes?
Oh, I actually just have a shameless plug. But first I wanted to say thank you so much for really touched and honored to be here. Just on that one thing where I'm part of an organization and we're working to end bottled water in Ottawa. So if that's one thing that you want to go and join, then we can do that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Juste dire en français que l'artiste joue un rôle avec ses œuvres, mais peut aussi jouer un rôle en tant qu'organisateur et je pense au Québec en ce moment, il y a un projet qui s'appelle le Pacte. Je ne sais pas si vous connaissez, mais c'est un projet citoyen où des artistes, des scientifiques puis ont un projet très simple de sensibiliser puis d'encourager le public à individuellement de réduire leur empreinte. Et ça marche. Il y a 200, 300 000 personnes dont moi, qui se sont donné le défi dans les 2 prochaines années. Et donc, le rôle de l'artiste peut être à différents niveaux. En tant que leader, en tant qu'agitateur. Et je pensais aussi, quand on parlait de la relation entre l'artiste et le scientifique, c'est plus ou moins la même chose. Parce que, dans le sens, les méthodologies sont différentes. Mais l'objectif final, si on regarde le big picture, si on utilisait des mots différents, artistes, scientifiques ont beaucoup en commun. Et c'est une question de méthodologie maintenant. Comment est-ce que ces différentes spécialités-là peuvent et doivent travailler ensemble. C'est juste ça que je voulais dire.
Oui, c'est très intéressant comme commentaire. Moi, je rêve souvent, je pense par exemple, les Beatles. Tout le monde les connaît, tout le monde connaît leurs chansons, ils sont connus à travers la planète et tout ça. Et tout le monde comprend très bien le message dans les paroles, les chansons des Beatles. C'est la même chose pour les Doors ou pour... Puis on prend, de notre côté, ça c'est des artistes, on prend un scientifique archi connu, Albert Einstein par exemple, il est connu l'ensemble de la planète, mais personne ne comprend rien de ce qu'il disait parce que évidemment c'est un niveau qui est difficile à faire comprendre. Donc évidemment, lui d'un point de vue politique et tout ça, il exprimait ses idées et ça on comprenait. Mais souvent moi je rêve à parce que je regarde aller la communauté artistique puis l'impact qu'ils peuvent avoir sur la société, sur la civilisation. Puis je rêve qu'on ait le pendant scientifique, c'est-à-dire qu'on ait des cohortes de scientifiques qui soient capables de s'exprimer dans des termes et passer leur message de la même façon que les artistes le font. Et au lieu que les scientifiques aient à passer par les artistes pour faire passer un message scientifique, que les scientifiques soient capables eux-mêmes de réduire leur message à quelque chose de compréhensible pour leurs congénères et que ce message-là passe directement. avec autant d'impact, autant d'audience en fait pour le message que les artistes peuvent l'avoir. C'est très difficile d'avoir un artiste qui, on a David Suzuki, mais c'est très difficile de combiner les deux, c'est-à-dire d'avoir un scientifique qui a la portée d'un artiste.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions à notre formidable panel? Je veux dire, je suis assez bouleversée et émue par la qualité des échanges. Two takeaways for me. There's no turning back. I think the facts and the commentaries are quite staggering. And the second takeaway is that we are all agent of change. I think incremental changes, small changes, it's really a very meaningful conversation, and I'd like to thank everyone. Last chance for comments, questions, suggestions. Yes.
I guess I've been sitting here enjoying this entire experience. I want to thank you for your time, but also the work you are continuing to do. But mainly, it's this undertone of communication, dissemination. How do we actually articulate this to parties that aren't already interested? Obviously, if we made the choice to come here this evening, we are already intrigued parties, right? And I found that I'm slowly discovering fascinating platforms that are trying to reconsider the spaces in which we have these conversations. We had a fantastic question or statement back here about how privileged we are to be able to come to galleries, to have an Arctic specialist be able to speak to us. That my point is, I suppose what I'm getting to is, I think something that was fascinating about the Anthropocene exhibit here was the augmented reality. This opportunity for those of us that are glued to our phones to almost force that device to have us engage, right? We created this platform in which the augmented reality it tricked us into participating through these synthetic things we carry in our pockets. So that is one thing that I find fascinating. I'm a huge fan of public art. I actually am a student of art history and psychology, just to give away why all of this is so fascinating to me. But my question to all of you is, as I was very heavily impressed by making a choice like augmented reality, have you encountered any spaces or attempts to maybe break down that fourth wall of the spaces in which we're having these conversations? Has there been any artists, any scientific platforms, anything that as of late, as you come from all very separate fields, that have really just inspired you as possible like new environments in which we can be having these conversations to ideally reach this public that is not artistically or scientifically inclined?
We're speechless.
I can definitely think of a number of interesting projects happening on Instagram. Like we have been talking a lot about visualizing climate change and accessibility and democratization. And of course, having a phone and internet is actually still very privileged, but if you do have it, there is one project, for example, called 52 Artists, 52 Actions, in which it's an Australian coordinated project, but it's kind of about these issues that we've been discussing, climate change and social justice, in conversation via artists who are coming from regions actually most affected by climate change. That's what I thought was really interesting about this particular project. Now, that's not the same thing as the general public just stumbling across this quite particular art forum, but I thought it was very interesting in terms of kind of connecting to people who are marginalized and don't ordinarily have a voice, and places that are not connected with the art world, for example.
Yeah, I came across a really fantastic initiative at an event I was at, and the guy was from Madrid, and it's called Media Prada. And what they do is they have a community space which is for technology. So local people can come in at any time and use their computers, and they have a number of community projects that happen through this space. So one, for example, was that local women wanted to design their own clothes, and so they had a whole section where they got technologists to be there with the women, and they were learning how to do their clothes through using the computers, and they were then making their own clothes. And they had both the sort of technology, but then they then had a space where they could set up their sewing machines and all those kind of things. And they did some absolutely brilliant projects where they did call-outs to the local community on a certain theme. So one of them was, for example, on sustainable food. And then they asked the local community to put forward projects, and then they would select from this open call. So it's the community themselves design the projects, rather than the traditional thing is you go and say, we want you to do this project with gardens about sustainable food, but actually the local people maybe wanted to do it a different way, and they actually enabled them, and they would put resources and technology into these projects, and some of the projects took a week, other ones took 2 years. And I just thought it was such a brilliant way that they've set it up. Look it up online, it's really inspiring. It's Spanish, but they do have if you don't speak Spanish like me, you can click on the English part of it. But I just thought this whole sort of democratization of technology was really inspiring.
We have one last question back here.
Okay, great.
Hi, Jonas Goldman, Environmental Policy Analysis. I really enjoyed your conversation on how you can integrate sort of artists and engineers, both working in their respective spheres to tackle the issue of climate change. My question is, how do you integrate policymakers into that? You know, Anthropologique is showing the effects of mass industrial projects, which is generally the approval is given by policymakers. Like you look at Trans Mountain here in Canada, or France has 365 million in foreign development funds devoted to fossil fuel projects. My question is, how do you reach that next step? How do you get those people, you know, with their finger on the approval form or the button to divert that money elsewhere to sustainable infrastructure, that next generation of sustainable projects in renewable energies and fuels?
Thank you.
Somebody won.
Well, maybe I can have a go at it. As I explained a little bit earlier, I think that the solution is to involve the policymaker right from the start of the scientific process and the studies. It's I tried to illustrate it earlier in our integrated regional impact studies. We start by bringing everybody, the stakeholders, but also the policymakers, the deciders into the mix, and ask them what kind of information, what is this. What is the knowledge that you cannot get and that you need to take your decision? And this is, I think, the way of the future. It's to ArcticNet, the network of centers of excellence. There are 155 network investigators from 32 universities, but we have as many decision makers from the different federal departments, from the communities in the north, from the. So it's a family where it's a forum where these people can talk directly from the start instead of coming afterwards or whatever. So you connect and you develop a network and affinities and everything with the policymakers, and so instead of trying to convince them, in fact, you develop the knowledge with them. And a good example of that is very quickly is we went into the Nunavik communities and we asked, what are your concerns? And the women there said, we're concerned with what's going to happen with the berries in the tundra, you know, the blueberries, the gooseberries and everything. And we said, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So we did the science. We studied what was happening and what we think would happen in the future, and then we said, things like the blueberry will decrease, but the gooseberry will increase, and they were really happy with that, because this is the kind of things that they need to take decisions to prepare, to make policy, to adapt for what's coming. So it's this mixing of deciders and producers of knowledge that you need to start right from the start.
I think the other thing is that technology is going to mean the whole way that we work in terms of democracy is going to change fundamentally. I mean, the whole thing about now we can use the commons, the technology to make democratic decisions in a way never before possible. We can make if we wanted to in our local area, we can make democratic decisions very quickly about a lot of things, in a way we've never been able to do before. So there's a really interesting space that's opening up for both, I think, artists, but also technology in this kind of role of sort of governance. And I'm looking at a project we're just developing for the UN at the moment, which is going to be in some Balkan countries. What they're interested in is they want local people to inform policy decisions in the way that you're talking about. And I'm going to suggest that we do something about green spaces, about the parks in the city, and we're going to do something where an artist works in the parks in the city, develops some kind of visualization with data from local people, and then that's going to go towards the policy makers in that country about how they use their parks. So there is this there's a kind of groundswell of things that are happening across. I know some people who work in America on agriculture. They're starting to work on trying to get the farmers themselves to work together to do more environmental methods of farming, and they all do it through this. They're using things like Bitcoin and the kind of blockchain and those kind of things. So there are ways, I think, of the future where a lot more people can inform decisions. There are negative examples as well of technology being used in terms of democracy, but I think there are also, it's important to see that there are some positive ones.
Well, I think the panelists deserve a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Tremendously enlightening. Thank you very much. Merci également à l'ambassade de France, à ArcticNet, à l'Université Carleton pour avoir contribué à cette soirée, surtout à l'ambassade de France pour avoir initié cette conversation extrêmement importante. Merci aux équipes du Musée des Beaux-Arts, merci à l'ambassade de France et toute l'équipe du service de l'action culturelle. Je vous invite à voir l'exposition si vous ne l'avez pas vue. Elle est exposée ici jusqu'au 24 février avant de partir en tournée internationale avec une présentation en Italie, et d'autres étapes sont également très intéressées par cette présentation. Et un dernier mot, si vous êtes intéressé par le sujet, je vous invite à approfondir le contenu à travers le catalogue qui a été publié à l'occasion de l'exposition. Andrea fait une contribution extrêmement intéressante, et il y a aussi une publication publiée par Steidel sous la direction de Edward Butinsky avec une contribution de Margaret Atwood. Donc 2 livres très importants en soutien à l'exposition.